Motion inputs are not good design. They are not the future of fighting games. Clip this, quote this, do whatever you want with this. I promise you, 20 years from now, we will not be talking about motion inputs because they will be gone.
Check out the awesome Underdog merch in the pinned comment and video description. Show your love for fighting games with these awesome t-shirt designs. Every purchase supports the channel and you look great while doing it. How's it going, everyone? I hope you had a wonderful weekend and I hope you're staying safe. Me personally, I'm a teacher and we did recently go back to work, and already we've lost some teachers to the big C. So if I stop making videos for any reason, then you know what happened to your boy. Now today's video is going to be a little bit different. We're going to be responding to a video clip, and sadly not the entire video because it was taken down by the creator. And that's really unfortunate because while he did take an extreme stance on this issue, there is actually a tiny kernel of truth to what he said. And that does tend to be the case with a lot of hot takes. You find if you dig a little bit deeper, there is that one tiny nugget of truth. Now to put this statement in context, the creator was mostly talking about how fighting games need to retain their audiences better. And this statement is absolutely true for fighting games. It's a very real problem. They do good at launch, but then they drop off pretty quickly depending on the game. For some games like Street Fighter and Tekken, they do tend to stick around, but for games like Mortal Kombat especially, they drop right away. Typically a NetherRealm game has like 1 or 2 years tops before people move on to a different game. And that's true for a bunch of fighting games across the board, so this video was trying to address how to fix that. And that's why it's such a shame the video was taken down, because there are a lot of good points made here, like better netcode. That's a great point. I'm sure you've heard a ton of creators talk about this, but there is no excuse not to use rollback netcode at this point in time. It's just a superior way to play. However, today we're talking about this hot take right here, which had everyone putting it on scrub quotes and critiquing it, and to be fair, it is an extreme position, but I don't think it deserved all the hate that it got. Or at least not entirely. Once again, he's mostly wrong here, but there is a tiny kernel of truth, so let's go ahead and watch it and we'll talk about it step by step.
Next is easily understandable universal mechanics, including the abolishment of motion inputs. I've argued with people about this in the past, and quite frankly, I'm done being patient with this argument. Motion inputs are an ancient relic of fighting games, and they're just simply not needed for any balancing reason at all.
So that's the big hot take that got everybody upset and had him on scrub quotes and everything else. And that's mostly because he's making the arguments that motion inputs need to go away completely, and of course that's not true. Motion inputs exist for two main reasons. For starters, it gives the characters a wider range of inputs for their move list, and this means the character is more unique. Having more moves gives them more personality. Because without motion inputs, the developers are limited to just a single button or a combination of button presses, and you run out of ideas pretty quick. And that's why certain games like Fantasy Strike and Rising Thunder do tend to have very small move lists for each character. And you could argue this does make the characters easier to play, and that is true, but it also means less depth, so players don't stick around that long because eventually they learn the characters and they move on. And then you have games like Tekken, which are famous for the opposite reason. They have a ton of depth because they have very large move lists. And as a result, the Tekken game can be out for years and players will still discover new tech for a certain character. So having a big move list is actually a good thing, and motion inputs make that possible. And then big reason number 2 for motion inputs is it makes moves that are a bit too strong to be a normal attack a bit tougher to do on reaction. So for example, Ryu's Shoryuken. In past games, this move was fully invincible, it's a great anti-air, and it does good damage. So if all of that was possible with a single button, it would be way too strong. And that's why in Fantasy Strike, there is a character with a Shoryuken attack, but it actually does damage to her every time she uses it. But if you ask me, that's a bit too extreme. It's much easier to just make it a motion input instead, because now that move that's a bit too strong to be a regular attack with just one button is a bit tougher to do on reaction. However, thankfully, most motion inputs are not tough to do at all. Quarter circle forward, quarter circle back, back forward, those are all easy. Nobody has a real problem with that. Although me personally, I don't even like back forward inputs. I think quarter circle forward and quarter circle back are good for a majority of special moves. And then of course you have the half circle back, which is good for command grabs because they do a lot of damage, so making the input a bit tougher is a nice compromise. And then for the really damaging command grabs like Zangief, you have a full circle motion, which is a bit challenging for a lot of beginners. However, in my opinion, that's because the input actually lies to you. It's not really a 360 input. You can actually start it down back and go all the way to up forward, and then just before you jump, press the button, and you will get a 360 input. However, a lot of players don't know that because the input shows a full circle, and that's why I've had a bit of a gripe with Capcom games for a while, because you also have the infamous Dragon Punch input, or the Shoryuken, or the DP motion, whatever you want to call it. This input for the longest time was displayed as a Z input, which is absolutely not true. That that is not how you do a Shoryuken or a Dragon Punch. It is just forward and then fireball really quickly. Or in other words, forward and then down to forward and then press a button. That's how you do a DP motion. It's not some stupid Z path. And that's always aggravated me, because back when I was trying to learn fighting games, I thought that was the actual input, and I have no idea why they say that. And thankfully, fighting games became a bit more mainstream, so now I think most players know that it's not a Z, it's just forward, down, forward button. But even so, that input to me is a bad input, because a lot of the time it overlaps with existing moves, like Cammy. I like playing Cammy. She has spiral arrow, and then she has the DP motion, and they're very similar. The only difference is one is forward, down, forward, and the other one is just down, forward. However, what this means is if you walk forward and then go for a spiral arrow on reaction to a fireball to go under it, you're going to get her DP motion instead, and I hate that. Now, there is actually a workaround. You can walk forward, and then if you see a fireball, you do a half circle forward instead, because pressing back will actually negate the option for a DP input. So that little workaround does ensure you don't get the DP motion, but in my opinion, the inputs should never overlap in the first place. That's just bad design to me. So already, that's one example where a fighting game input could be changed in a way. You could have spiral arrow be a punch, that way it never overlaps. It doesn't make sense because she does lead with her feet, but it would fix the problem of getting it by accident. Now, of course, you would have some players who argue that's the challenge of playing the character, is you can't just do the DP instantly or the spiral arrow instantly. That's part of the game design. However, once again, for me personally, I don't think inputs should ever overlap if you can help it. However, I am digressing a little bit, so back to the main point. He is saying that fighting game inputs are unnecessary, and I don't agree completely. However, once again, there's that tiny nugget of truth. So for an example, let's look at supers in Street Fighter. So in Street Fighter V, a lot of the charge characters had their supers changed completely. In the past, it was charge back and then forward and then back forward and then a button. However, in Street Fighter V, this was changed for a bunch of characters, and instead it became a generic down forward, or a double quarter circle input. And what this meant was, even if you were playing a character like Bison, who's a charge character, you could still do an instant super whenever the opponent whiffed a move or went for a jump, any of that stuff, you could pop it instantly. You didn't have to charge. And I was a huge fan of this change, but then when Guile came out, he still had a charge super. And it didn't make much sense to me because his super isn't leaps and bounds better than anybody else's, so I don't get why he has to charge it when no one else does, including other charge characters. So once again, that's one more example of how inputs could be changed to be a bit more consistent and a bit more fair to the player. So while I in no way agree that inputs should go away completely, I do agree that difficulty is unnecessary for some characters.
It is completely lazy design to balance moves around difficult motion inputs.
So I don't agree entirely once again, but there is an element of truth to this statement. For starters, there absolutely is a reason for difficult inputs if the move does a ton of damage all by itself, like a super move, and Sajam does a great job of explaining this. In summary, the reason a super move has a more difficult input in a lot of fighting games is so you can't do it on a moment's notice to punish absolutely anything, at least not without practicing a bunch. And then on top of that, this move also becomes tougher to do under pressure. If you and the opponent are both very low on life and the opponent makes a mistake and you barely catch it, maybe you can't do that input in time. And once again, that's by design. It's supposed to be something tough to pull off under pressure, which is why it's a bit more complicated than the other typical inputs. However, once again, I don't think the difficulty is necessary when no other character has to do it. So another good example is Geese as a guest character in Tekken 7. In that game, Geese has what's called a pretzel motion input, which is a very difficult input that pays homage to the fighting games he's originally from. However, even so, there's no reason for it to be that difficult because in Tekken, everyone's super is just one direction and a single button. Or in fact, you can actually be even lazier because the game allows you to map the super to a single button for every character, and it's universal if you want to do that. However, of course, this shortcut does not work for Geese because his super is unique to his regular rage art, but even so, I don't think there's a reason for it to be that difficult to do. And not only because everyone else's super is not that difficult to do, but because Geese's super, despite that crazy input, is not that much better than everyone else's. In fact, I wouldn't say it's better at all. It's kind of in line with everyone else's. And even though it does pay homage to the game that he's from, it doesn't really fit in Tekken 7 because no one else has an input like that. So once again, there is a tiny kernel of truth to this statement. I don't think it's wrong for a move to be difficult, but it is odd when it's out of place and nobody else has a difficult input. And I will go a step further and say that if a move exists in a past game and then to balance it, they just make it tougher to do, that's not a very fair balance either because a pro will do it no matter what. If you don't believe me, then you can watch top Akuma players. They can do Raging Demon on a dime. They can even cancel a normal into Raging Demon when it whiffs, so they're that good. So the idea that Akuma can't land that move in every situation is not true in the hands of a top player, so it doesn't really balance the move out at all. And you know what? As I'm saying that, Street Fighter V had a clever way of balancing it. It requires all of your meter and also requires you to be in V-trigger, so one extra layer before you can actually do do that move.
Would not argue for this in any other genre. I'm not even going to pretend that there's a reasonable argument for motion inputs as a base core design.
This point right here is honestly the weakest one in his entire argument. The idea that no other genre has motion inputs is like me playing a fighting game and complaining that I can't scope in. There's no reason to scope in a fighting game. You don't have to aim at the character in that way from a first-person perspective. So of course a first-person shooter isn't going to have motion inputs. However, a first-person shooter is a good example here, because while the player does handle most weapons the same, there are certain guns that are stronger than others, and as a result they have restrictions on them. For example, a sniper rifle in Call of Duty requires you to scope in to get an accurate shot, whereas most regular guns can be fired from the hip and they're still pretty accurate. And the reason the sniper rifle can't do that is because the damage is so high. It kills most players in a single shot. And as a result, that gun requires you to scope in. Even if you quickscope, it still requires a special level of skill to use effectively, otherwise it would be way too strong. And the same can also be said for a rocket launcher in Halo. The rocket launcher has a huge area of impact and does a ton of damage. And since in most Halo games your character moves very slowly, it's very easy to kill you with that weapon, and as a result it travels very slowly, which is actually not true to how most RPGs behave in real life. They travel very quickly, but in Halo you move very slowly, and the move does a ton of damage and has a big area of impact, so it has to travel slowly or it wouldn't be fair. And even the Spartan laser is a great example of this. It does a ton of damage and kills pretty much everything in its path, but it has to charge for a good time before it fires. So now imagine if the sniper rifle and the rocket launcher didn't have those restrictions. You just aim the sniper rifle like a shotgun and kill everyone from a mile away. Or imagine the Spartan laser and the rocket launcher are just as fast as regular guns in the game. Just instant, boom, kills everyone in there like a 10-block radius. So these same skill requirements and limitations could also be applied to a fighting game. And it's the exact same case with special inputs. They're too good to be done raw. Now there are some examples, like here he has Fantasy Strike, and Rising Thunder did a similar thing as well, and it can work if the game is designed around that. However, at the same time, if you watch Vesper Arcade play this game, he is bodying people. It does not help casuals at all to design the game this way. In fact, from what I've witnessed, it gives the pros an even bigger edge because they already have all this knowledge and experience, but now it's just easier to do.
The old Bilbsy would have spent time explaining why. I'm done with that because no one listens to those arguments anyway. Motion inputs are not good design. They are not the future of fighting games. Clip this, quote this, do whatever you want with this. I promise you, 20 years from now, we will not be talking about motion inputs because they will be gone.
Oh my goodness, so that's the take at the end that I think got him in trouble. If he had just expanded a bit more on this statement and not been so extreme at the end and also a bit condescending, I don't think it would have gotten the response that it gotten, at least not to the extreme that it did. I definitely don't agree with how he ended this statement, and it's a shame because he wasn't doing a terrible job. He wasn't right for the most part, but he was being very mature and professional about it, and then at the end he just kind of ruined it with that final statement. There is one thing I do want to say though. As we speak, League of Legends is actually getting a fighting game, and it's rumored that game may be very similar to Fantasy Strike, where the special moves actually have a cooldown and don't require a special command input. And that's not just because Riot wants the game to be easy for casuals, it's because it also pays homage to League of Legends. That game has a very easy to use system. You have buttons that do the whole attack for you for the most part. So it makes sense their fighting game might be very similar. It'll have a single button that does a special move, but it will have a cooldown, and higher damaging special moves will have a longer cooldown, or perhaps even the super will have a really long cooldown. And if the game does play that way and it's well received, then I wouldn't be surprised if more fighting games follow in some manner, because keep in mind, Riot is very big because League of Legends has huge payouts at tournaments. We are talking a crazy amount of money to play a game, and as a result, these tournaments have gotten bigger and bigger. They fill entire stadiums. They do about as well as the Super Bowl. It's just crazy. Okay, they don't do that good. At least I don't think they do as well as the Super Bowl, but they're really big, bigger than pretty much any other tournament you can think of outside of maybe Fortnite. Once again, I digress. The point is their tournaments are huge, so if their fighting game does well and is well received, it's going to have a ton of money for its tournaments, which means a lot of pro players are going to jump ship from whatever fighting game they're playing and dedicate all of their time to being good at the League of Legends fighting game. And if all of these things happen, then other fighting games are going to follow suit because they won't realize it's all the money that people are after. They'll think it's the gameplay they're after, and they're going to copy that in their future games. So just imagine if this person does end up being right simply because the League of Legends fighting game does so well. It's a long shot, and I personally don't think it's going to happen, but how hilarious would it be if we all ate our words? What if inputs do go away for the most part because that game does so well and does not use inputs? That would be nuts, and the creator of this video would be so vindicated. One final thing I do want to touch on that I forgot to mention earlier, and I'm kind of face palming for that, is that Street Fighter V, a very popular mainstream fighting game, already has characters without motion inputs. You have Ed, and you also have Falk. Both of these characters don't rely on on motion inputs for the most part. Instead, you have multiple buttons that are used for their special moves. And for me personally, that was actually tougher than a command input because it was so different. It just felt weird for me and very alien. But I imagine for a casual player, it wasn't that tough to make the adjustment. And I will admit that just pressing 2 buttons to do an invincible Shoryuken is way easier than trying to do a Dragon Punch. And the same was also true for the anti-airs. It's pretty much impossible to jump on Falk or Ed if the player knows what they're doing, because they can react on a dime and just boom, 2 buttons, pow, anti-air. And the reason I bring those characters up is they do not have a cooldown, so no motion inputs, but also nothing else to really compensate for it. And even so, those characters aren't considered absurdly OP. I don't think so. I know Ed's definitely not top tier. He was terrible, and now I think he's middle tier, maybe barely above middle tier. And I think Falk is a bit above that, but I don't think she's top 10 or top 5. But it's been a very long time since I played Street Fighter, but she is better than Ed. So as you can see right there, we have 2 characters in a mainstream fighting game without any motion inputs. So this guy wasn't completely wrong, and that's why I made this video. He's wrong for the most part, but he's not wrong completely. Wow, so this video is a lot longer than I meant for it to be, so I hope you enjoyed, everyone. If you did, please leave a like. It really does help the channel. And while you're down there, don't forget to suplex that subscribe button. That way you never miss a future video. Make sure to come back next time, and as always, stay underdogs.